Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today is a special edition of the show because we have not one but two guests. I always lead off guest episodes by saying that I do not take a specific stance for or against anybody's political views or any political groups they belong to, but that has not been an issue with any guests so far, and it's especially not going to be an issue today due to the nature of our topic, which is properly handling tough political conversations. How do we handle intractable conflicts, as our guests call them? Our guests describe those as large-scale, protracted conflicts that are very difficult, but not impossible, to solve. So how do we solve these conflicts, or at least come to a better understanding of each other? What does all this mean for our polarized political climate today? Answering such questions is a major driver for my career, and such has been an indelible part of the careers of my guests for much longer than my own, and they are Doctors Guy and Heidi Burgess. They co-founded the Conflict Information Consortium, a multidisciplinary center for research and teaching about conflict and its transformation at the University of Colorado in 1988. Among the projects they've created as part of the CIC is the Conflict Resolution Information Source, the Beyond Intractability Knowledge Base, Moving Beyond Intractability, and the Constructive Conflict Initiative. They have also served as adjunct instructors with George Mason University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So, without further ado, let's dive deep into the conversation on resolving political conflicts with our guests. Please welcome Dr. Guy and Heidi Burgess. Both of you, thank you so much for coming here today. How are you doing?
Pretty well.
Thanks for inviting us.
Hey, thank you for coming on. When I found you guys and what you both do, I was like, oh, that's a perfect guest spot. I have to get in touch with you guys. So I mentioned in the intro that you both co-founded the Conflict Information Consortium, the CIC, in 1988. So what exactly led you to do that? Did you notice the general trend of politics as increasingly toxic and polarized even back then? Or were there one or more specific events that inspired the CIC? What exactly led to it?
Well, the big thing was the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And in the 1980s, they put together a conflict resolution program as a major grant-giving arm of the foundation. And they had the image of doing to the conflict resolution field what scientific medicine had done with medicine. And they talked about how medicine in the 20s and 30s was sort of an art and nobody had ever really thought very systematically about it. And there was the rise of scientific medicine where you actually tried to systematically evaluate treatments, develop theories, all of this sort of stuff. They wanted to do that to this field. And they devoted a large amount of money over several decades. And we were lucky enough to have been supported by them for almost 20 years. But that was the big driver. Now, we came out of we're children of the Vietnam civil rights era. We went into sociology, really is at a time when there was a lot of interest in addressing these problems. And this was, in a sense, the golden age of the conflict and resolution and peace building field, where we really thought we could kind of easily handle these problems.
And slightly different take. You'll find out that we always answer things differently. Hewlett's goal originally was to create a field of conflict resolution. And there was a lot of discussion early on about what a field is and what it took to create it. And we all together came up with certain criteria for a field, a fairly large settled knowledge base, journals, professionals, all this stuff. And they funded it for 20 years and then came to the conclusion that they'd succeeded. They created a field, and it's true. Everybody who was involved had to admit it was true. We were very disappointed when they pulled out and said, okay, we did it. We're done. Bye. That was quite a trauma for a lot of folks, us included. But they did. They created a field, and that field still exists.
And there quite active now in strengthening democracy.
True.
Yeah, it just goes to show how long-standing this issue has been. Sometimes polarizations and on these conflicts are treated as something new when really they're not. And I think it's hard for especially people from my generation. I was born in 1993, so maybe it's not quite as I guess you can't really appreciate as much how long these kinds of things. I mean, really, it's been going on since the founding of the nation. But
Since
speaking of this,
humans,
Goes back further than that.
since
yeah,
humans
exactly.
existed.
Since
Right.
humans, exactly, it's just part of human nature. But speaking of that history, so it's been nearly 40 years since you started the CIC, and that is a considerable length of time for most things, but it's practically an eternity in the context of the American political landscape. For example, Ronald Reagan was right near the end of his second presidential term, and now it's Donald Trump's second term in office. So, in terms of your work and studies, and we just talked a little bit about just now what how much some things have been the same, but in terms of your work and studies, what has changed in those 40 years, and what has stayed the same?
The way we actually had somebody ask us the same question not too long ago, and the way I answered it, and again, Heidi will have a different answer. Um, but I tell the story of when I was a kid. We were all terrified of polio, and it really was scary. And then I have a vivid memory of going down to the elementary school and eating a sugar cube with the first polio vaccine. That was the end of it. And wow. And in the early 70s, Richard Nixon decided, oh, heck, we should do the same thing to cancer. So he initiated the war on cancer, and he was expecting to find the vaccine. That was it. We're now, 50 years into the war on cancer. And while it's not as scary as disease as it once was, it's still pretty scary, and we're a long way from solving it. Now, in 1988, that was the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was the end of history. That was the end of the Great Cold War and the nuclear nightmare that we all grew up with. Um, it was everybody sort of thought that the whole world had decided that a democratic system organized around capitalist economies was the way to go, and that we could cooperate and solve all sorts of problems together, and peace building was and conflict resolution. And we all really thought we had finally got this figured out.
We thought we had the sugar cube.
The book Getting to Yes, which introduced interest-based bargaining, was kind of the equivalent of the polio vaccine. And things were optimistic. And then we've discovered in the intervening 35 years that history hadn't ended. There are great tensions that remain in the world between authoritarian societies and liberal societies. People have, in many liberal societies, lost track of why it was we invented democracy in the first place. And there's, disturbing articles about how people don't think that's worth protecting anymore. And we've discovered that really the world is awash with terrible intractable conflicts driven by a whole new range of very sophisticated weapons. And that the conflict problem is, like the war on cancer, a whole lot scarier and more difficult than we thought it was back in 1990, 88, when we founded the consortium. And what we and everybody else in the field in various ways has been struggling with is, okay, how do we deal with this bigger, much scarier reality?
And I'll just add a footnote, which is that when we started focusing on what we call hyperpolarization, most people call it toxic polarization or effective polarization or just polarization, we started focusing on that pretty shortly after Trump's first election, maybe even some before it. And lots of people told us, we've always been polarized. There's nothing different. Well, we think there is something different, that the level of polarization now is much worse than it had been earlier. And there are tools to push it, such as social media and the internet and now AI, that didn't exist back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And yes, Guy and I have had a lot of discussions about whether the 60s civil rights era, with all of the political violence that went on, was worse than now or not. I don't think we've resolved that one yet, but folks didn't have the tools to spread hate and fear and discord that they have now.
George Orwell would have been really excited with the new technology.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the specific point of affective polarization. There's some projects I've been working on, including a TED Talk that's talking about affective polarization. So that's kind of how I refer to it. So I appreciate pointing that out. But yeah, it is this whole, you kind of already got into the next question I was going to talk about, which was, do you believe that we are more polarized than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago? Because there definitely is, even if we're not technically more polarized, there definitely is something different. So do you think how much of it do you think is just that we are more polarized, and how much of it is that we're just more aware of polarization and there's more ways for it to fester? Or is it just a matter of both?
Well, I have to back up, and I can hear a colleague of ours, James Cone, yelling in my ear as he's watching this, because he runs a program called More in Common. And he's put together something that he calls the perception gap. And his argument is we're actually a lot closer together than we realize that we are. But it's the noisy folks out on the fringes who we're all paying attention to. And yeah, they are more polarized than they used to be. But he would say, and he has good data to back it up, that actually an awful lot of people in the middle are not that far apart. The problem is very few people realize that. And our social structures and our communication structures and the way we get news these days doesn't permit us to discover that. So we all make the assumption that those guys over on the right or the left, depending on which side you're standing on, are totally crazy and evil and you hate them. And then almost always, if you end up somehow talking to one of those people and really listening, you'll find out that you and they agree on an awful lot of stuff. So the answer to whether we're polarized or not depends on who you're talking to and how you're measuring it, in terms of what people really believe or what in terms of what people think people believe.
There's also a true believer effect, that politics is driven by people who really believe in their heart of hearts that the other side presents an existential threat to everything that they care about. And once you conclude that, you really decide, okay, I'm going to go all out to fight these guys. I have to. I don't have any choice. And so you have, sometimes they're unflatteringly called the wingnuts on each side. But they're raising important issues, and that sort of disrespectful language is good for a laugh line, but it isn't very helpful. But there are these true believers on each side that are much more politically aware, and much clearer about who the good guys and the bad guys are, and much more committed to a fight. Folks in the center tend to be disillusioned by the whole process because it's awfully ugly to them. They don't know really which side to root for because they kind of see both sides of the issues. And they are far less prominent in the political debate. We also have, in the way our democracy is structured, with primaries and the two political parties, the center is in many ways disenfranchised. We have another colleague who is he was campaigning with anyone who will listen, arguing that the big voting rights crisis is the center, that the candidates are determined by party activists on the left and the right. In many cases, the centrists can't even vote in those primaries. So there's certainly a lot of proposals out there to politically empower the center in ways that get closer to really equitable representation.
But the thing that frustrates me is that the two parties are doing their darndest to try to prevent those structural reforms from happening. So one of the big ones is ranked choice voting, which I think is really a good idea. I think Guy agrees with me. But it's having real hard time getting off the ground because the political parties are making up stories about how bad it is and getting it defeated wherever it gets on the ballot. Or it did succeed in Alaska, and it sounds like they're going to get it overturned because they realize that it will harm the political party power. So they're working against that. They're working against a lot of other reforms that could be really helpful. And that's discouraging.
And what ranked choice voting does very quickly is that if you have a state that tilts strongly Democratic or Republican, the way the current system works is, take California. If you're a Republican, you might as well not show up. But with ranked choice voting, it sort of readjusts the primary process so you have an election between somebody who's center right and somebody, or center left and somebody who's far left. And in Republican states, it goes the other way. But that gives you a choice. And in lots of places, there really isn't a choice.
Yeah, funny that there's so many things that you guys, so many great points you brought that I wish I could address them all, but obviously only have so much time to do that. But one of the big things I talk that you talked about is last week on my podcast. It was just me that time, but I was talking about political apathy and how that can unintentionally drive polarization too, because you have a lot of people, partly because, well, they don't know which side to go to, or they just don't like how
They're
nasty
disgusted
politics
with
is
it.
getting. Yeah, they sit aside, but that unintentionally inflames polarization because the people who are polarized are participating at an outsized rate. So then it makes it seem like it's more polarized than it actually is. That idea of false polarization. So I suppose that for you guys, is this polarization a lot of that too, that false polarization where people perceive it to be more polarized than it is, so then they kind of react in a polarized manner, and then it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Right. I mean, I think that's true. And the discussions that I've had with James Cone, who very much believes that, is whether or not that matters. Now, he thinks it matters a lot, and he's trying to empower and raise up and make visible the middle, and that's great. We really, really need to do that. But in the meantime, it's the visible polarized folks who are running the show. And to pretend that they aren't, I don't think is very realistic. They are. We want to change it so they aren't, or at least so that they're not all of the story. I don't want to disenfranchise them any more than I want them to disenfranchise the center. But we all should have a voice, and we should be working to bring in and get interested and involve the apathetic people in the middle. And the one kudo that I want to bring up is that there's a lot of work being done at the local level to do this. Federal level is, many people think, a bridge too far. It's too far gone. But there is a whole lot of work to enfranchise folks at the local level to do collaborative democracy, deliberative democracy that really does listen to both sides, or all sides. There's often more than two. And we've been doing some work with some of the groups that are doing that. And there's a lot of hope in what's going on there.
Yeah, with the local stuff, that's really great to hear. I mean, obviously, besides the general work of trying to bridge divides, is you have that more that apathy or lack of understanding of what's going on. It gets amplified at the local level. Not and it's not entirely the fault of the people participating. It's local government, even for those of us who are involved in this stuff for a living, is very inscrutable. It's very hard to find information about a lot of these local. Now, if it's like New York City or Chicago or some big city, yeah, it's a bit easier to find information on them. But some of these more smaller counties, it's for example, it's really difficult to find information on them. So that I can definitely appreciate that you're involved in that work. And speaking of work that you've been directly involved in and the CIC has been involved in, what are a couple of, if you want to go expand more on that, obviously feel free, but what are a couple of one to three direct impacts that your work with the CIC has had that you're particularly proud of that you can demonstrate for the listeners and viewers?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is that we've been trying to, and this is another way of defining intractability, is to deal with the awful complexity of society. And years early in our work there, we had a visiting scientist who actually worked on nuclear weapons at the Sandia
Oh,
Nuclear
wow.
Weapons Lab. And he explained to us the difference between complicated and complex systems. And complicated systems are the things that people are really good at. They're machines that have lots of parts, but we understand how it all works. They have blueprints. If they break, we can fix them. They have short, sharp feedback loops. If it doesn't work, you find out real quick and you fix it. Complex systems are social systems where there's no set of plans. The various parts, individuals act in unpredictable ways, and you really can't predict what's going on. The analogy that I use to explain this is imagine a pool table and taking the perfect pool shot. That's a complicated task. But if you do it right and you're good, you can run the table. But what a complex system is imagine a gigantic pool table with millions and billions of balls. And at the same time, you have millions of actors with cue balls and cues all trying to take the perfect shot at the same time. And it's just chaos. And one of the real challenges is to figure out how you improve a system like that has so much noise. And we make a distinction between the sort of engineering and medical problem solving models. Engineering works on complicated systems, and you know how engineers and mechanics fix things. But the way you fix complex systems is the way doctors work. Your human body is a complex system. What they try to do is identify things that are going wrong. Sometimes they're simple and they can fix them. A cut, a strep infection, they can treat with antibiotics. Sometimes they can't fix it, but they can provide symptomatic relief. And some conditions they still haven't solved. And so what we really need is a whole set of interventions designed to fix particular aspects of the conflict system that are going badly. And we put together this approach we call massively parallel democracy building or problem solving or peace building, depending on the audience. But the idea is instead of having a grand solution, you have a massive number of people simultaneously working on different projects, each affecting some different aspect of the system that tries to nudge it in a more positive direction.
And this idea has been picked up by a lot of people, which is why we're proud of it. We think that it's helping move the field in a useful direction. When we started, we were focusing on intractable conflicts, and there was a colleague of ours in Syracuse who came before us even. He wrote a book in intractable conflicts and their transformation. And it was kind of his book that got us started along that line. But at the time, we were the only two, and of all of the Hewlett centers, there were about 20 Hewlett centers. Nobody else was looking at intractable conflict. Now, many more people are, and many more scholars are, and there's many more practitioners who are looking at it, and our notion of massively parallel is being picked up, and we're pleased about that. I would answer that another thing that we're proud of is just the degree to which Beyond Intractability has come to be used as a well-known and trusted resource in the field. We meet people constantly who say, oh yeah, I know Beyond Intractability. I've used that a lot. And there's people who I've never heard of. And it's really gotten out there and people really rely on it. And there hasn't ever really been anything that matches it. So we're pretty pleased about that.
Now, what we try to do with this massively parallel idea and also the Beyond Intractability system, we're about to release, fingers crossed, a new, much improved version of Beyond Intractability, is it breaks down all of the different components. We've identified over 50 different roles within any community that are active in some aspect or another of the conflict process. And what we try to do, and the nice thing about the system is it's very, very multidisciplinary. It tries to bring together what we collectively know. It has thousands of references and articles. But this is the kind of problem that you need to look at all aspects of it. If you just focus on one little solution, it's not going to work. You got to deal with the whole problem. And that's beyond the scope of nobody's smart enough to do that. So you have to break it up into pieces. That's the way human society does big things, is with the division of labor.
Oh, that's fantastic. I really like the dichotomy between complex and complicated in particular. That's not something I really thought about before. And actually, it's a good segue into the next question, because another really great distinction that I liked from the Beyond Intractability website, because for another project of mine like that, like the talk I'm planning to give at some point, I came across one of your articles. This is actually how I learned about the Conflict Information Consortium in the first place, and the Beyond Intractability website. And you had an interview with, it was called Business as Usual Part 3, The Blame Game. And in short, you talk about the authors of a book named Difficult Conversations, and they make a distinction between blame and contribution. And I thought that was really fascinating. But for people at home, want to hear it from your own words. How do we differentiate between blaming and contribution? And how do we shift conversations from blame to contribution?
That's a really important distinction, and it's one thing that really contributes to our polarization, affective polarization, hyperpolarization, whatever you want to call it now. And the book, as you said, is called Difficult Conversations. It was written by Stone, Patton, and Heen, three of our colleagues from Harvard. Want to give them credit. It's a great book. I've given it to both of my kids for when they have relationship problems or workplace problems. If you've got problems, you want to know how to deal with a difficult conversation, get that book. The difference between blame, we all know what blame is. It's your fault. You did it wrong. It's a you statement, and it puts all the blame on you, and I'm blameless. It's never that clean. Almost always the other side, meaning me, contributed in some way to what went wrong. Maybe you didn't give clear enough directions to the person who you wanted to do what you wanted them to do, so they didn't. Maybe you didn't realize that they were overwhelmed with 6 other tasks. There's all sorts of ways in which we think that it's a cut and dried problem. We run into this politically all the time. The left thinks that the problem is entirely Trump, and the left hasn't done anything wrong that might encourage Trump voters. And Trump voters are the same way. They think that the entire problem is the left, and the right hasn't done anything wrong. And that's simply not true. Both sides have contributed to our polarization. Now, we've gotten into a lot of discussions as to whether one side has contributed more than the other. I'm not going to go there right now. But I think most people would agree, I hope most people would agree, that there are some things that each side has done that has contributed to the hyperpolarization situation that we all are suffering from. So that's the difference between blame and contribution. Contribution realizes that I'm part of this too. There are things that I can fix, quite independent of what the other person's doing. And yes, the other person has things to fix too, but it's not all on them. We both need to own up to our part of the problem and work together to create a better relationship that will solve whatever problem is bothering us.
Yeah, that accountability is just in such short supply these days. And to your point about not wanting to get into whether somebody has contributed more or not, I think if you do go down too far that path, that still kind of circles back to blame, where people are like, okay, yeah, I did this wrong, but you did 50 other things wrong too. So
Right.
really, this is more your fault. Then it's just like, okay, then we're back to
We're
where we
back to the
started.
races again. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So how do we then how would we more effectively, one or two ways that we more effectively shift it from blame to contribution?
I think the way we need to do it is to get people to understand what's going on more in terms of a system. It gets back to Guy's idea about complex systems. Uh, in heated, intractable conflicts, as we call them, it's been going on for a long time. There's a lot of tit for tat. One side does something, the other side responds, the first side. It's going back and forth. There's a long history. You can't just simplify it to one or two things. You have to realize that there's all sorts of factors that are playing into this. So we talk about the importance of complexifying your understanding of what's going on. And with our students, we did an exercise where we got them to talk about any particular conflict. We decide on a conflict that people are interested in. Interestingly, it was, and I've been doing this for years, very often it was immigration. Immigration's been a hot topic for a very long time. And you start out by asking, well, what's the problem with integration? Write down on a piece of paper what the problem is. And they'll write down a few things, and it's all the other guy's fault. And then you start pulling it apart and you start asking questions. And then they start realizing, oh, yeah, well, my side's done some things that are causing problems too. And you start asking, well, what causes that? Because they name something that's wrong. And I say, well, what's causing that? And they end up with this huge list of all these causes, some of which they're contributing to, some of which the other side's contributing to, some of which outside factors totally out of everybody's control are contributing to. And then they go, oh, yeah, this really is more complicated than I thought. Yeah, it really is more complicated than you thought. Okay, so let's start figuring out where we could influence this system and who can take responsibility for what.
And one of the things, we have a little exercise on this on the website, is we call it the common ground exercise. When you're looking at one of these really controversial issues, you ask people to, first of all, try to identify, okay, what is it within this context of this big thing that we can decide that we agree on? And there may be a whole range of sort of sub issues that, yeah, no, this is not what we're fighting over. And then you try to identify, okay, what are the things that we disagree about? And then you try to identify, well, yeah, okay, this, and this. And then you say, well, of these things that we disagree about, how many of them are attributable to different images of objective reality? So I think that this plant's going to kill me when it's release of toxic chemicals, and somebody else thinks it's safe. Okay, that's something you could try to straighten out and find out who's right. And then there are some things that are moral values, that abortion is murder or is something else. And so you focus on, okay, for the things that are fact-based, how might we figure out an answer? And for moral questions, we ask, how can you constructively debate this? I mean, these are things that people have to make tough decisions about. And what's the best way to do that? There's a related story in this that goes back to the early days of our program, which was originally the Conflict Resolution Consortium. And we told our activist friends that, hey, we got a big grant for a conflict resolution center. And they thought we were going to force them to compromise on their basic values, thought we were traitors. They wouldn't have anything to do with us. And we'd send out invitations for seminars, and everybody would say no. And then one day we got the bright idea. We said, hey, look, you guys are involved in all of these terrible fights. Let's come talk not about compromise and resolution, but how we can handle those fights more constructively. And we literally went from a 95% rejection rate to a 95% acceptance rate.
Oh, wow.
Once you reframe the field, not as a third party, somebody who's trying to sort of squish this conflict because it's disagreeable, but from the perspective of the advocates on both sides that have issues that they really care about. They just want to know how to pursue those issues more constructively. Then all of a sudden people are interested.
Well, I think that just goes to show just how important, because there is just that whole ends justify the means. Everybody's so worried about winning political battles that they don't really think about the whole process of how we get there. And if the process isn't great, then you're not going to have a result that benefits anybody, and the process is just going to get continually worse. So I really appreciate you pointing that out. So that just really goes to show just how if you focus more on the process, we can have much better dialogue. But so let's get a little bit more into these, as you call them, intractable conflicts. And again, it's defined on the Beyond Intractability website as large-scale, protracted conflicts that are very difficult but not impossible to solve. Now, Heidi, you brought up immigration as an example, and then abortion from Guy. Is maybe what's another couple? And we don't need to go super in depth if you don't want to, but what's
well, I want to give you one caveat, which is I made the mistake years ago going to a meeting with a bunch of family mediators and making the assertion that family conflicts weren't intractable. Oh boy. I found out that I was wrong. I was lucky enough to have lived as a child in a functional family, and I had a functional family of my own and not a whole lot of friends who were divorced. And boy, those divorce mediators let me have it. So you can have intractable conflicts between a husband and a wife. There's no doubt about that. That's just not the kind of stuff that we look at in our career and on our website. But I don't deny that those kinds of conflicts can be intractable. In terms of U.S. politics, there's two levels. I would argue that the red-blue divide itself is an intractable conflict in which a whole bunch of other ones are embedded. So abortion's embedded, immigration's embedded. What else are we fighting over? We're fighting over taxes. We're fighting over
climate.
What?
Climate, gender, race.
Yeah.
Size of government.
Yeah. So all those are intractable, and it's all under the umbrella of the red-blue divide. And then, of course, there's international ones, and the one we're hearing about constantly, of course, the poster child of intractable conflicts is Israel-Palestine. I was just reading a history of it today that pointed out that it's been going on forever, and that used to be called the Israeli-Arab conflict, and it got labeled Israeli-Palestinian later on.
And it goes way back.
And we've talked to people from Kashmir or India or Pakistan who says nobody pays attention to us. We're just as intractable as they are.
Yeah,
And then
they've been going at it for a long time too.
Yeah. And then Ukraine and Russia, it hasn't been going on nearly as long, but it sure is being very difficult to solve.
Yeah,
So there's international stuff and there's domestic stuff. And by that, I mean internal to one country. And then there's domestic, meaning family, but we're not going there.
Now, the other thing
Right.
that's important to make is a distinction between underlying conflicts and dispute episodes that occur within the context of those conflicts. So there are, within the environmental movement, there's a long-running tension between environmental preservationists and you might call them developers. We're going to post an excellent essay on the length of the Arab-Israeli, the conflict between the Arabs and Jews that go way back into the mid-1800s, and it goes back further than that. But within each of these conflicts, and these are, in one level, these are the real intractable conflicts. They arise because of deep inherent tensions between people with different worldviews, different cultural traditions, different economic circumstances, different geographic realities that play out in an endless series of disputes. Some of these disputes are resolved at the negotiation table, not too many, sadly. An awful lot are resolved politically, some through electoral politics, some through legislation. Some are resolved in the courts, some are resolved in the court of public opinion, some are resolved militarily. But after you resolve one dispute, that's just one aspect of the big thing, and the big thing will be there again and again and again. And what you need, and one of the things that we've argued, is that democracy is above all a dispute handling system. And it needs to work through this endless and gigantic chain of disputes over everything that gets played out again and again in different jurisdictions all over the country. And if you think about democracy, and there have been books, Bill Urey wrote a book on dispute handling systems and how you design them. And it's a different way of thinking about democracy. It's different from just thinking about it as a structural thing. You've got the three branches of government and checks and balances, elections, and everybody votes. It's really how you handle these disputes. And it isn't just how you come up with a solution that somebody wins and somebody loses, but the people who lose have to feel decent about it. And they have to feel that it's fair, and they have to feel that if they have other complaints, they can come forward.
And they might win next time.
And another exercise we have on our website and Substack newsletter asks people what they owe the losers in an election. That what is too much to ask for and to take from them. And it's these obligations that we make to the losers in democracy's elections that hold it all together. And this is why you asked earlier if things are worse than they've ever been. And I think in a sense they are, because the sense of restraint, and the Trump administration is hell-bent to undo anything that the progressive left cares about. There's no limit to it. And likely the left will respond in kind. This is the escalation dynamic where it gets worse and worse and worse. And it's been slowly building over the last, a good long time.
And when we've done that exercise, people have a really hard time figuring out what they owe the losers if they're the winners. They're not at all convinced they owe them anything.
That kind of makes me think of whenever we hear, this personally, one of my pet peeves is the idea of a presidential mandate. And governors, I'm sure, think of it the same way too, but usually you hear presidential mandate, where because they won, that means they have been given the all clear to do whatever they want, which is
Right.
like that's nobody ever. Well, I mean, there's a few people that are saying that, but I mean, that's not what everybody who's voting for you is saying, and it's one of my particular gripes. And it's, I mean, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. There's people that do that all the time. So how do we? And we just talked about it a little bit now, and talked about it a little bit earlier, because this whole just hell bent on winning arguments and conflicts, not really solving anything, just winning arguments. That's this whole ends justify the means. So as long as they get their way, how they got there doesn't matter, even though that makes the next issue an even bigger fight. So how do you think we can better convince people that to shift the focus from winning things to trying to actually fix the process of politics? How do you think we go about making sure that people try to fix the means before fixing the ends?
Well, I think this is really well demonstrated by the work that's being done at the local level, that it's very easy to point out, and I think it's hard to dispute, that when we just focus on winning, we're not able to solve any problems. It's very rare. I mean, Congress does do more than we realize they do, but in general, they're not have not been successful in tackling any of our big problems. There's been an obvious consensus solution on immigration for a long time that hasn't managed to get implemented. There have been 80 or so percent, if I'm remembering my numbers right, of people agree on abortion policy, but that hasn't been implemented. We've gone either totally one way or totally the other. That if we just focus on winning and stomping the other guy, and Guy's got a great lecture on what he calls the 51% hammer effect, where you want to get 51% and then hammer the other side. If we focus on that, we're not going to solve any of our problems. And if you ask people, do you want to solve problems? Everybody goes, yes, everybody wants to solve problems. At the local level, folks are able to do that. So at the local level, you can get people together and focus on a common problem, one that's being addressed quite frequently around the country, is affordable housing and homelessness. It's a problem almost everywhere. And it's pretty easy to get Republicans and Democrats together to work on that problem together. Other things like childcare, schools, better policing are things at the local level that people can come together and work on and see solutions to. And I keep on talking to the folks who are doing this at the local level. And one of my standard questions is, okay, how do we scale this up? And there's various answers about how to scale it up. But I think the answer is that we have to get people to understand that our current processes are not solving our problems. We're not solving climate. We're not solving immigration. We're not solving poverty. We're not solving racial divides. All of the things we're defining as problems, we're not solving. Why not? Because our processes stink.
The line that, or rather the thing that I've been advocating, is that we need a great reframing. That right now we tend to think of our problem as the other side. They're the enemy, and that the goal is to defeat the enemy. And if we were smart enough to realize that the real threat to our future is not the enemy, but it's our hyper-polarized, dysfunctional political process and the fact that we hate each other, then all of a sudden we can be on the same side, and that we're working to fix the broken political process that is causing us such grief and preventing us from solving problems. We've gone on to another story that I tell is that when I was just out of graduate school, this is 20, probably 15 years before the first mention of the climate change movement on Wikipedia. I had the fortune of working at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And down the hall were the guys who were doing the initial research on climate change. And these were climatologists used to going to climate conferences. They were scientists, physicists, and they just discovered that we're ruining the climate upon which we all depend. And they were starting to say, my God, how do I go from being a climate scientist who does nothing about politics to advocating for transforming the global energy system and building a coalition to do it? And that started a set of conversations that took 15, 20 years to get to the point where the IPCC won a Nobel Peace Prize. It's now been 20 plus years since that. The climate consensus is unraveling with the same terrible political problems that we mentioned earlier. And what we've been arguing is that the conflict problem is just sort of where the climate scientists were 50 years ago, 45 years ago, that there are relatively few number of people who really understand how all of these things interact in ways that are a fundamental threat to everything that we care about. And that,
like life on Earth.
yeah, and that what we need to do is to start a long-term process similar in scope and duration and funding to what we're putting into climate change, to learn how to handle our conflicts and to build a dispute handling system that can really protect everybody's interests and work through all of these issues, work through the divisive effects of new high-tech social media and bad faith action, all sorts of things. I'd like to see one of these funders that's plunking $1 billion down on climate change to plunk $1 billion down on this.
And I'd argue to them that they would probably be more successful in climate change if they did.
Well, they won't be successful in climate change until they do, and that's getting increasingly evident as Trump and all of this stuff is unraveling.
Yeah, and go back a little bit to something that Heidi specifically talked about, how we're not solving these problems. Even if you think that you're solving these problems, obviously they've got their specific people, their specific way of what solving a problem is. Like you guys said earlier, your idea of what solving an issue is, when the pendulum swings to the other side, which it inevitably does, your solution is suddenly going to evaporate, and then then we're just going to keep going back and forth and not actually have any long-term solutions. So we talked about a little bit more of the larger scale methods for handling intractable conflicts. Let's talk more about the individual level, because we do want to emphasize that we can fix these problems with intractability and polarization, and they're not going to require, not everything requires this very high level,
massively parallel.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't require a whole bunch of people. Individuals can make their own changes too. So what are some simple actionable ways, like 2 to 3, that any individual can employ to constructively handle these tough political conflicts?
I used to teach a class on conflict skills. And the very last class, I said to the students, if there's only 2 things that you remember from this class 10 years later, the 2 things I want you to remember are just 2 words: listen and respect. If you listen to other people, that gives them respect. They're very likely to then listen to you.
Mm-hmm.
And you're very likely to figure out that you're not actually as far apart as you thought you were. Or if you are as far apart as you thought you were, you might find out why they think what they think and realize, given where you came from, given your experiences, I could see why you feel that way. I disagree, but I can understand that a honest, well-meaning, intelligent human being could come down differently from where I have come down, given your life experiences. This is why dialogue focuses on how did you come to believe what you believe, stories of people's past. If you listen very often, you're not going to solve everything, but you're going to make things better. And the same way, treating people with respect. Doesn't cost you anything to treat somebody with respect. And when you do, they're more likely to treat you with respect. And if you don't, if you treat people disrespectfully, if you humiliate them, we have a colleague who says humiliation is the atom bomb of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
If you humiliate them, you can be sure that they're going to hate you. You can be sure that they're going to be out to get you. And it doesn't cost anything, even for people that you really don't like, even for people that you think don't deserve respect. That doesn't matter. Give them respect anyway. You're more likely to get better behavior back.
The other thing to clarify a little bit is this concept of massively parallel democracy building. And it's a word that we borrowed from computer scientists, and it's sort of fallen out of contemporary use. But there was a time when the goal was to try to build super ever smarter microprocessors. And then you sort of ran into a limit. They could only be so smart. And then they started figuring out, well, the key is you hook up a whole lot of different processors together in a massively parallel configuration. So you have a system of specialization among processors. So you take a big problem like intractable conflict and you divide it up into zillions of little pieces. And each piece is manageable. They're not all doing the same thing. They're doing different things, but they all contribute to solving the big problem. So the thing about the massively parallel approach is you don't have to wrap your mind around the whole thing. You need a sense that there's this massively parallel effort going on. One of the things we've tried to document is the full scope of this. But within that, there are lots and lots of different opportunities for people to get involved in democratic electoral reforms. There are dialogues. There are people who are trying to do social media reforms, all sorts of things. And you pick an area within your area of expertise and where you have some influence, and you get involved. And the key to solving this problem is lots of different efforts doing different things that are all trying to push us toward a democracy that works. So it's not like there's one thing. The one thing is find a one thing in your area of expertise that you can do and recognize that there are lots of possibilities.
So people can get active in their school. They can form a discussion group at the library of people who are concerned about a local problem. They can form a discussion group in their workplace of people who are concerned about, I don't know, overtime hours or whatever it is. Something that you're concerned about, something that you might have some influence over. Start grappling with ways of dealing with the problem. Listen to everybody who is concerned about it and start trying to develop ideas for solutions.
And you can do this on big things. The political platforms of the major parties arise out of zillions of small group meetings at community levels. And then, some people from communities go to the county level and the state level. And these discussions are things you can get involved in. And you can try to stick up for your side's political beliefs, but leave a space for the other side too.
Couldn't have said any of that better myself. One more big question here before I get to the fun, random, non-political question, as long as we've got the time. Obviously, we recently in the news, a little over a month ago, we sadly saw in Minnesota where former State House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband were, well, let's call it what it is. It was an assassination. And other Minnesota lawmakers and political activists were targeted as well. Do you believe that this event or others like it will lead to a breakthrough in how the country handles intractable conflicts and polarization?
Well, I was thinking about answers to this, and there's one key concept is what's sometimes called the boiled frog syndrome. And the story is that if you put the frog in a nice kettle of nice warm water and slowly turn up the heat, he won't notice that it's getting hot enough to be a threat, and he'll cook to death. But if you turn up the heat a little too fast, he'll say, my gosh, it's getting hot, and he'll jump out. So the thing about the slow escalation of this set of hyperpolarization dynamics and the hatred that goes with it is that we slowly edge up to each taboo line, and it takes a while to cross it, and then we edge up again. And it's never at any one event never seems so much worse than what went before that we all want to jump out and do something. And with the Minnesota killings, there was hope that people would say, "Oh, that's something that demands that we change course." And if you go back, you asked about the '60s and early '70s, and I have again on our website somewhere is a thing that the Washington Post did of all of the violent incidents just in Washington, D.C., following the assassination of Martin Luther King. And there were thousands, every street corner, everywhere. And you had cities burning down. So we haven't got to that. That
Fortunately.
was a big thing, and it provoked some real response and led to a whole range of civil rights reforms in Great Society. But things might suddenly get worse. But the thing that we've been building for, and this addresses another one of the questions on your list, is what does it take to change? And are people ready? And people aren't quite ready now. Most everybody's locked into this hyper-polarized, we got to either defend Trump or get him. But there's going to be a point where we cross some boiled frog threshold and people start saying, no, this is too much. We got to get out. And that's the window of opportunity. And part of what we're trying to do with Beyond Intractability, and many of our colleagues are trying to do, is to be ready for that. So when people say, my God, we've got to change direction, there is information there about down in detailed information on how to do it. So you can take advantage of that opportunity. And that can come up very fast. And we've seen that historically. And we just need to be ready.
Well, fortunately, we have work from people like the two of you to hopefully move us in a better direction. I think there is a good portion of people that are ready for real, lasting, positive change, but just got to actually convince people to come together, I suppose. So I want to end on, like I said earlier, I like to end with a fun, random, non-political question, just to change things up and lighten up the mood a little bit, because sometimes this can obviously get pretty sour and dark, but also just variety is good anyways, and I have various interests anyways. So today's random question of the day, for obviously for both of you. So excluding what you do now, and just don't worry, assume you have the capability to do anything, there's no obstacles in your way. What is another job that you'd want to do for a living?
I actually thought about that off and on throughout my career. And I think I would want to be a kindergarten or a first or a second grade teacher.
Oh,
And the reason is that when I taught college and graduate school, I was really discouraged by the fact that many of the students didn't really seem to want to learn. They were there to get their degree. They were doing as little as possible as they possibly could to get out. I also was volunteering in my kids' first and second, kindergarten, the young kids' classrooms. Those kids were sponges. Oh my
Oh
gosh,
yeah,
did they
little
want to
kids are
learn?
great.
And I often thought to myself, why am I spending my time with these guys? I should be spending my time with these little ones. These are the guys who are going to learn.
Yeah, yeah. With because I sometimes coach at my local YMCA, and I've done various sports, whether it's basketball, football, kickball. Is another one that's escaped soccer. But I really enjoy all the age groups, but the teenagers can sometimes be very taxing to deal with. The little kids, they're
Enjoy.
hanging on your every word. Yeah, you can't teach them as much because their brains can't handle all that yet, but at the same time, it's a lot easier to get them to actually listen. So, what about you, Guy?
Well, my things are not quite completely independent of the work that we've been doing our careers, but I sure wished I knew a lot more about the theory of complexity and how ecosystems evolve. And I've just been reading a book that goes back, 3 billion years before life, what we used to think of as the beginning of life and the evolution of. There were billions of years that it took for the chemistry of life to evolve. And how those processes work and the astonishing complexity. And a lot of this is all based on big time. It takes forever for things to work and for evolution to work its way through. And the process of selection decides whether a change is worth preserving or not. And the rate of change that we're looking at now is so fast that a lot of the evolutionary mechanisms are breaking down. And I'd also like to really understand what artificial intelligence is. At one level, it's a technology that's much better at listening to very large groups of people and making sense out of what they're saying and thinking than any human could possibly be. And I still have this illusion, I hope it's reality, that it might be possible to build an AI system that would provide an alternative to the way human information systems have evolved over the last 20 or 30 years. We went from the time when Walter Cronkite was one of three voices that people listened to, was the most trusted man in America, and to this absolute fragmentation of information sources where whatever you believe, somebody will tell you you're right and everybody else is wrong. And that's terribly divisive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering whether we can build a newer, better system that will get us past some of that. And AI technology, which is certainly being used by the forces of darkness and division, might be harnessed for the other purpose.
Yeah,
So on my optimistic notes, I try to imagine what that might be.
that would be fascinating too, and that's something I've wanted to do an episode about, is the fragmentation of mass media. Just even from when I was a little kid, just how much everything is proliferated is crazy. But if I'm going to talk about, for me, completely different than what I do right now, it's got to be astronomer. Because when I was a little kid, I was a huge space nerd. I remember I had this giant uh, kids book that was about as tall as I was at the time. This was back when Pluto was still a planet, that had stuff about the solar system and everything. I still love space, but obviously I can't devote as much time to learning about it as I used to. But I mean, yeah, if I didn't have to worry about knowing how to do all those calculations and everything, but just and all the crazy stuff that's out there is just so incredibly fascinating to me. And I could go on and on about that, but we got to unfortunately wrap things up. And really, this is just scratching the surface of what we just talked about today. So want to thank both of you so much for being here. Any other media that you want to share, and I can put some of your websites and the newsletter and everything in the show notes, but anything else in particular that you want to highlight?
Just that the website is www.beyondintractability.org. And as Guy said, we think we're about to debut a completely revised system that's much better. So don't go there now. Wait a couple of weeks. We've been saying we're about to do it for about 6 months, but we really think we are about to do it now. And the big problem with Beyond Intractability always has been that there's so much stuff there. It's really hard to find what you're looking for, although the search system does work, but there's tons there. And that's one of the things that we think we're improving with this new iteration, is it will be much easier to find things. But we also have a Substack newsletter, which is Beyond Intractability. There's no www, so it's just beyondintractability.substack.com. And that comes out 2 to 3 times a week. And
it's free.
It's free, and it's always going to be free. And if you want to keep up on what we're doing, and we're focused now very much on U.S. democracy and to some extent failing democracies in other parts of the world. And also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one that we've been particularly focused on for the international stuff. But there's lots of stuff there, and we welcome people contributing to it. And it's not just us. We do have a lot of other guest authors. If you want to see what's going on with us and what our current thinking is, that's a good place to go.
And the new website reorganization is built around something we call a guide, and it tries to step by step take you through the process of thinking through these conflicts to understand the big picture and then find a place within this massively parallel structure that you can make a contribution.
Well, there you go. And yeah, I will definitely put links to those in the show notes, although don't go to the Beyond Intractability website just yet. Although I will say I do have a little bit of I do kind of like the nostalgic quality to how it's distributed. Maybe not quite like where I've had to go research some local government websites and it looks like they were made in early 2000s GeoCities. Maybe not quite that nostalgic, but I do kind of like how the Beyond Intractability website is now.
It's going to look familiar.
Well, perfect. All right. I'll definitely put the links to those in the show notes. But once again, to you, Heidi and Guy, thank you very much for being on here. And for all of you at home, thank you very much for tuning in and checking out the podcast. Links in the show notes for my Facebook, LinkedIn, medium.com, which I write on from time to time, my Matchmaker FM profile, my 5-day educational email course about some of the ways we unintentionally make polarization worse and how we can fix those mistakes. And I think that's might be something. Oh, my email and my website as well. So once again, thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, take care.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.